Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to go to San Francisco Bay Area and speak with journalist and radio show host J.P. Sottile, whose recent piece for The Ecologist magazine is called Ukraine, Chevron, Condi Rice, and Shale Gas. So, J.P., welcome to the Kaiser Report.
Good to be with you, Max.
Okay, so why don't we just start connecting the dots? Ukraine, Chevron, Condi Rice, shale gas. How do you connect it all?
Well, it's actually not that hard. On November 5th, Chevron announced a 50-year deal to develop shale gas in Ukraine. It's up to $10 billion deal by the time it's over with. And as everybody, I think, knows by now, one of the bones of contention with Russia, Europe, and its transit point, Ukraine, is Russia's domination of the natural gas market in Europe. So I thought it was very interesting when the deal was announced that Chevron was involved in developing shale gas in Ukraine. Now, that would have been with the previous government of Yanukovych, and I believe that that led to a lot of the pressure coming out of Moscow for Yanukovych to reject the economic deal between Ukraine and Europe, and that then, of course, led to a cascading number of events, which led to the deposing of Yanukovych and the crisis in Ukraine, as it is now called.
Okay, now let's talk about the natural gas business in Ukraine. 90% of Ukraine's oil and gas production comes from the east along the Russian border. So which gas reserves of shale gas is Chevron focusing on right now, hoping to exploit? The ones in the east, or I believe there's some in the west as well?
No, they're going for those eastern fields, and also you have to keep in mind that Chevron is heavily invested also in the Caspian Sea oil and gas area, heavily invested in Kazakhstan, which of course is another former satellite of the Soviet Union, former satellite of Russia, and also Exxon is involved in dealing with those gas reserves, trying to develop those gas reserves.
Right, and of course when you speak about Chevron, Condoleezza Rice's name comes up. She's been involved in the oil patch for quite some time. She was with George W. Bush, of course. He was part of Texas and the oil industry in America, big oil. So can you just talk a little bit more about how she fits into the puzzle?
Well, you know, it was also interesting that former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, former board member of Chevron for just over a decade. As a matter of fact, when she joined the Bush administration as a national security advisor, at that time, Chevron had a tanker, a 192,000-ton tanker named the Condoleezza Rice. About 3 months after she joined the Bush administration, they decided to rename the tanker because they thought it was maybe a little bit untoward to have a tanker roaming around the world with the name of the national security advisor on it. She wrote an op-ed once the Ukraine crisis started, after the EU deal was rejected, and in this op-ed, she, of course, determined that the United States was not doing its job on the world stage as a world leader and world power by stopping the aggressive tactics of Russia and Vladimir Putin. Of course, she has a bit of an interest, being a former Chevron board member, and at the end of that op-ed for the Washington Post, she also mentioned that it would be great if the United States could keep 10,000 troops permanently in Afghanistan. Of course, Afghanistan, not known for its oil and gas reserves and riches, but is also strategically located for the TAPI pipeline, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. And right now, Chevron is negotiating to run that pipeline once it is built.
Well, certainly the dots, as you are connecting them, we start to see the picture. Added to the picture, JP, we have to look at beyond just the big oil. We're talking about Cargill and Monsanto, or big agriculture. They've got big plans for Ukraine. Tell us about that.
Well, this is where it all comes together, because Condi Rice is often thought of as a neocon. Another neocon would be Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan's wife is Victoria Nuland. I think Victoria Nuland would be now sort of known to most people as the woman who famously said on a phone call that Russia could the European Union, in relation to what was going on in Ukraine, that the European Union could do something to itself. I think roger itself would be another way of putting it. Well, Victoria Nuland also on December 13th went to the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation and talked about how the United States spent $5 billion helping Ukraine achieve its European aspirations. Well, she's connected to Cargill through something called the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council. Well, how does this connection work out? The U.S.-Ukraine Business Council is an investor in the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, where Ms. Nuland was speaking on December 13th. And also on December 13th, that was the day that Cargill invested in a Black Sea port to help open the Russian market to its agriculture. Well, Cargill is also heavily invested in Ukraine in a company called Ukraland Farming. They just bought a $200 million stake in Ukraland Farming. As a matter of fact, they bought that stake, or it was announced, on the very day, January 12th of this year, that 50,000 Ukrainians flooded Kiev to protest the government of Yanukovych. They're all connected through Freedom House, a guy there who worked with Ms. Nuland, who is Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. She had a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, a guy named David Kramer. David Kramer serves on, he's actually head of Freedom House. Freedom House is one of the organizations that the United States uses to stoke democracy movements around the world. It is actually responsible, along with the National Endowment for Democracy, for funding many of the opposition forces there in Ukraine. And David Kramer also serves on the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council. If you go to the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, which is a very interesting organization, on the executive board of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, you'll find Cargill, Monsanto, John Deere, CNH International, which is a farming equipment and tractor making company, Eli Lilly, and DuPont Pioneer, DuPont Pioneer being the genetically modified organisms and agricultural wing of DuPont. And they all serve together under the guidance of a guy named Morgan Williams. Morgan Williams is CEO and president of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, and he has been a fixer for Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, other big agricultural companies in Ukraine for the last 15 to 20 years.
Right. I mean, this is fantastic journalism on your part, putting together connecting all the dots. Let me put it to you very simply. In your view, are U.S. corporations in the process of attempting a coup in Ukraine?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. This is something that's gone on in U.S. foreign policy for the better part of 100 and 125 years since the open door policy in China at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Of course, you have the United Fruit Company in the 50s, 1950s, taking over the banana plantations of Guatemala. You have United Fruit Company heavily invested in the sugarcane plantations of Cuba at the time of the Cuban Revolution. And I think right now what you have in Ukraine, Ukraine was formerly known as the breadbasket of Russia. It accounted for about a quarter of all the food that folks in the Soviet Union ate. It is famous for its black, fertile soil, a rich, deep soil. And interesting to note that in 2013, the Ukrainian agricultural economic sector had over 13% growth, which is stunning, Max, as I'm sure you can think about it in terms of economic growth worldwide, 13.7% growth. And in this coming year, this year that we're now, it was projected last year for 2014, that meat exports were going to rise by over 8%, pork exports were going to rise by over 70%, and big ag, American agricultural corporations, are trying to get into this former breadbasket of Soviet Union. It is perfectly positioned there between Russia and Europe, also the former Stans to the south, to be a huge exporter of meat, a huge exporter of grain, of corn and wheat. It's actually the third largest corn and wheat producer in the world. And the company that Cargill bought announced the buy on the 13th of this year, Ukraland Farming, is the world's 8th largest cultivator and its 2nd largest egg producer. So when you look at where the money is there in Ukraine's agricultural sector, which is interesting because we tend to focus on oil and gas, and we don't really think about agriculture as such a a rationale for military or democracy-stoking interventions, but I think that this agricultural market is so hot, American agricultural corporations really want to get in there.
Right now, JP, you mentioned United Fruit Company's involvement in the Guatemala. Of course, they changed their name, I believe, to Chiquita
Yep.
Banana. And this, of course, is the beginning of decades of the U.S. empire, U.S. hegemony, U.S. dollar reserve as global reserve currency. And if you go to Guatemala and you go to South America, you look at what's happened in Iran, you look at what's happened in other countries around the world, that steamroller of U.S. hegemony around the world, it's never really met any significant resistance. Are we at the point where this U.S. empire hegemony machine, industrial, the military-industrial complex, they've now running into Russia. They've got to deal with China, Russia, China, Iran. So this is now shaping up to be a bit of a battle royale. How would you handicap this as a betting man? It seems like so far the U.S., particularly with the Victoria Nuland's captured voicemail, where she's just outright trying to become the puppet master and install a fake dictator in Ukraine. It seems as though this U.S. multi-decade empire-building story might be heading to its end game. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm trained as an historian and I'm a journalist. It's hard for me to project the future. I would say this story out today, that the United States is still the global leader in military expenditures, dwarfing the next 4 to 6 military budgets combined. I think when you spend the amount of money that the United States spends on military, it's hard to bet against that. I mean, if we're talking about stock market investments or handicapping the commodities markets in the future, the United States has some staying power. But I think what we're seeing here is what some people call a multipolar world. So it's hard to say. I think what you do see here with what is happening with Russia and also the power that China has over the U.S. economy with its through debt and the control of production of consumer goods, that the United States is now not as free to operate as it may have been in the past. It certainly is not as free to operate as it did in Iraq, because I don't think that Iraq could happen again.
All right, JP, we got to cut it there. We're out of time. But thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, JP Sottile. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.